1st of January 2025, while we were all celebrating New Year's Day, a very, very important economic event occurred in the US. The debt ceiling suspension ended. Well, maybe it wasn't such an important event. The US has a legal limit on how much debt it can take on, but Congress votes to raise it practically every year, and no doubt it will do so again this year. Visualeconomik community, the US has a very serious problem with public debt, and nothing indicates that this is going to be solved. According to official agencies, the US is going to have a deficit of over 5% over the next decade, something not seen since the Great Depression. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem, during this year alone, Donald Trump will have to refinance $10 trillion, almost a third of the $36 trillion total debt incurred by Americans. That's more than $100,000 per person, more than a third of GDP in just 1 year. And no, the US is not going to default, but the debt rating agencies no longer trust Uncle Sam as much as they used to.
Fitch downgrades the United States long-term ratings to AA+ from AAA.
But that's far from the worst of it. The US already spends more than 15% of its public revenue on debt interest payments, 3 times more than the G7 average. This is partly because the US has much lower taxes than other developed countries, but it's also true that the dollar is the world's reserve currency. What does this mean? Well, the world is crying out for the US to borrow. Big business, central banks, and foreign governments. Come on, all of them are itching to get their hands on more US Treasury bills. Even so, now they are fewer and fewer, and if you don't believe me, ask the Chinese, who trust the American government less and less. Of course, for everyone to have the debt they want, the US has to go into debt. What does it get in return? Basically, very cheap debt. And yet, even with such cheap debt, American finances are choking on interest payments. According to some estimates, in just 30 years, interest payments will be a much more significant item than the primary deficit. Or in other words, interest payments on the debt alone will eat up a larger percentage of the public budget than what European countries such as Spain spend on healthcare. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking. What about Elon Musk? If Milei has got 15 GDP points of public spending, why couldn't the richest man in the world do something similar with his new Doge chainsaw? Well, we'll talk about that in a future video. But to understand what Elon Musk can and cannot do, you first need to get a sense of the magnitude of the problem. In Visualeconomik community, this expression has been repeated so often that it has almost lost its value. But this time, it may be true. We are looking at a time bomb. A bomb that will not only turn US public finances upside down, but one that will also aggravate the huge problems that the dollar has been having lately, with a drop of nearly 5% of its value in just a few days. So we at Visualeconomik have been asking a few questions. How did we get to this point? What can Donald Trump do? Will he really be able to fix it? Well, let's begin. If we're talking about the US and public debt, we would almost have to go back to the very origins of the country. But let's start with a politician you all know very well, Ronald Reagan. Reagan inherited 3 things from his predecessor, the recently deceased Jimmy Carter. The first was public finances stronger than Popeye, with a public debt of only 30% of GDP. But on the other hand, he inherited brutal inflation, and thirdly, a rather complicated geopolitical situation. What worried Americans most was inflation, and to combat it, Carter let Fed Chairman Paul Volcker work, raising interest rates above 20%. These policies were a success, but they also dealt a hard blow to the economy. And of course, higher rates meant paying more interest on debt. What does this mean? That by paying more interest, cuts would have to be made in other items to balance the budget. But of course, at that time, the US was coming out of a recession, and doing that would be very unpopular. The outcome? Take a look for yourselves. Reagan had promised to reduce the deficit to 1/3 of its value. However, what he did was to double it from 3 to 6% of GDP. And the worst thing is that, on paper, the public budgets were balanced. However, many items had a magic asterisk, an asterisk that meant, in reality, we have not lowered this item as much as we say, but we'll do it in the future. Don't worry. Of course, they never did. To give you an idea, under Reagan, the US went from being the world's largest lender to the largest debtor, at least in absolute numbers. The debt continued to grow under his successor, Bush, in part because of the crisis of the early 1990s, and so it went on until we reached the year 2000. In that year, this photograph was taken, where we see Bill Clinton with a giant sign behind him, debt-free by 2013. Of course, they seem to be taking it as a joke, but jokes aside, the truth is that Clinton was quite serious. This may surprise you coming from a Democrat president because, in theory, that is the party of public spending, but Clinton not only slowed the growth of the public debt, he also managed to reverse it. Then came the event that changed everything. After 9/11, the US entered a militaristic phase that skyrocketed its public spending, and to this must be added a rather large tax cut by Bush Jr. The debt did not skyrocket, but it did change the downward trend that had been there before, and the rest of the story I'm sure you already know. In 2008, the Great Crisis hit, and Obama pulled out all the stops, bringing the federal debt to 100% of GDP. Then came COVID. So Trump and Biden did the same. Mind you, Biden had a secret weapon to combat the debt overhang: inflation. If you promise to pay someone $100 in 10 years, but inflation has reduced the value of the dollar by half, it is really like paying them $50. Or to put it another way, inflation has forgiven you half the debt. However, that also creates its own problem. Public debt fell a bit for a couple of years, yes, but more inflation means more public spending, more deficit, and more debt. But Biden's biggest problem was interest rates. After COVID, there was a very strong correlation between the extra government spending that governments undertook and their inflation. To combat this inflation, the Fed raised interest rates. In other words, it forced the government to pay more interest on its public debt, and that is how we get to where we are now. If you noticed, there have been 3 major moments where public debt has increased. The first was with Reagan and the brutal inflation crisis he inherited. The second was with Obama and the 2008 crisis. And the third was the Trump-Biden duo in the midst of the COVID crisis. The pattern seems quite clear. Public debt rises when there is an economic crisis. Or in other words, if there is no crisis, then there isn't much to worry about. However, not everything is so straightforward. Take a look at the following graph. What you're seeing on the screen is the evolution of mandatory versus discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is the one that does not have a fixed budget item. For example, if there is a law that says you have to pay $10,000 for each newborn child, in theory, you don't know how much you're going to spend. It would depend on how many children are born. And of the discretionary spending, half is defense spending, and the other half is programs that are much easier to cut. The trend is clear. Mandatory costs, which are difficult to cut, have risen from 50% to 70% of total costs, and are expected to continue to grow. And what expenses are we talking about? Well, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone. Basically, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which take up 3/4 of mandatory spending. Now do you understand why we are so skeptical of Elon Musk's chainsaw? And understanding this is critical. So far, increases in debt have come in response to shocks such as financial crises. But while all this has been going on, mandatory spending has been growing, slowly but surely. And believe me, cutting here is much more complicated than cutting discretionary spending. Basically because we're talking about pensions and healthcare. Or to put it another way, rather than a time bomb, we're talking about the frog cooking in the pot without even realizing it. Worst of all, this increase in mandatory spending ties the government's hands and feet, hindering it from acting when it is needed.
We have already lost our fiscal capacity to react to shocks. If the $5 trillion pandemic response was more debt than people will hold and caused inflation, the $10 trillion response to the next crisis will face even more trouble.
In fact, a shock doesn't even have to happen. We're already seeing a case where public debt could prevent Americans from pursuing a very good policy: Donald Trump's tax cut. In his first year, Trump passed the TCJA, which, among other things, carried out the largest corporate tax cut in US history. According to the Tax Foundation, this tax cut was a success. It created the equivalent of 850,000 full-time jobs. Investment grew by 11%, and wages rose by $750 on average. However, most of these cuts will expire this year, and if they are extended, it will be completely irresponsible. The reason? Well, although this tax cut has been fantastic for the economy, it hasn't paid for itself. In fact, only 16% of the fiscal hole has been plugged by taxes on new economic activity. If the US didn't have much debt, then yes, this policy would have increased the deficit a bit. But hey, the positive effects would far outweigh the negative ones. But the more the debt, and especially the more deficit you have, the worse it is to go further into debt. In the next 10 years, the TCJA could add between $4.6 and $5.4 trillion more debt, which would mean increasing debt over GDP from 184% to 210% by 2060. Of course, what is fiscally sensible is one thing, and what Donald Trump is going to do is quite another. Trump not only plans to extend this tax cut, he also plans to add other extra tax cuts, such as making Social Security pensions tax-free. In other words, it's estimated that Trump will lower taxes and raise public spending by $10 trillion over the next 9 years. And that's in the central scenario, which, given what we've seen in recent months, may be very optimistic. How much of that hole does he plan to plug with more taxes or spending cuts? Well, less than 40%. To give you an idea, Trump's tariffs wouldn't pay for half of what it costs to expand the TCJA. Now, wait a minute, because it's true that Trump plans to shoot the deficit even higher than it already is, but it's possible that the debt could be brought under control by cutting compulsory public spending, particularly in healthcare. And no, we don't mean leaving the poor to die on the doorstep of hospitals. In reality, the US spends $13,000 per person per year on healthcare. It is by far the country that spends the most. For example, the second highest is Switzerland, but it spends $4,000 less. However, this expenditure is not reflected in metrics such as increased life expectancy. In other words, the US spends much more money on healthcare than other countries for worse results, and this happens for two reasons. The first and most important has nothing to do with healthcare. The US has such a low life expectancy because it has many more deaths from violence, traffic accidents, and drugs than other countries. But there is a second reason why healthcare is so expensive: insurance. In the US, health insurance is heavily subsidized, but the out-of-pocket costs that people have to pay are not. The result, people get insured for everything, even if they don't need it. And since doctors take a commission for their work, they often recommend more expensive tests and treatments that don't provide any more detail. At the end of the day, it's not the patient who pays for it, but the insurers and the government. Indeed, one of the main proposals of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is to eliminate this distortion between insurance and the money you pay out of pocket. And let's hope it happens, because at this rate, the two main trust funds that support Medicare are going to go bankrupt, and putting in even more public money to bail them out won't exactly be cheap. Obviously, this would be a much better way to cut spending than what Biden did, which was to force the drug companies to sell their products for much less money than they were making. According to academic studies, this policy did serve to reduce the costs of the healthcare system, but it harmed innovation in new drugs terribly, which will be a huge cost in the long term. Besides, who knows? Another good chunk of US healthcare spending is explained by its extremely high obesity rate, and there are already very, very effective drugs against obesity that could save billions of dollars in the long run. Now, the main reason for hope is this other graph. US debt is at record levels, yes, but the interest rate paid on that debt is well under control, and in fact is much, much lower than during the Reagan and Bush eras. And how is this possible? Well, the key is interest rates, which have fallen from 9% to 2% since the 1990s. And if you want more good news, public debt can not only be measured as a percentage of GDP, you can also compare it to accumulated national wealth, and that metric has been stagnant for about 10 years. Be warned, we've already told you how current rates are hurting US finances. What's more, inflation is still high. At its last meeting, the Fed raised its inflation forecast by a few tenths, which is much closer to 3% than to the 2% target. Moreover, today's debt is not comparable to that of the Reagan era. These days, it's much more difficult to cut, basically because we're talking about pensions and healthcare spending, not the military budget or other discretionary items. Visualeconomik community, the US does have a serious problem, and Trump doesn't look like he's going to do much to fix it. Quite the opposite. Nevertheless, although politicians don't usually make it easy for us, at Visualeconomik we don't like to be apocalyptic. There are many challenges, yes, but it's also true that things are not as bad as they appear at first glance. And we will elaborate more on all these issues in an upcoming video on Elon Musk's chainsaw. But now it's over to you. Did you know the state of the US debt? Do you think the deficit will continue to grow with Donald Trump, or will sanity reign? Are we facing a bomb about to explode, or a frog in the saucepan? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.